Okay, so it's a great pleasure to be here today and to have this interesting panel of hand-picked experts, which we all choose very carefully to be here. And I would like to introduce the next speakers. Right on my left is Athina Burka. She is leading the Privacy and Technology Program at ENISA, the European Network and Information Security Agency, and she will tell us a bit more on what this means in practice. Next to her is Stefan Schiffner. He is a researcher at Luxembourg University, and among other things, he has developed programs to assess privacy-enhancing technologies to measure some of their qualities, and he is also in charge of a repository which collects this information. Walter van Holst is representing EDRI, European Digital Rights. That is a Europe-wide coalition of NGOs, non-government organizations, for digital rights, one of which is, of course, privacy, and another one, data protection. And EDRI has been working on a project to provide guidance on the development of privacy-friendly websites, about which he will tell us something. Ruben Verboch, who is at the very end, so I'm sorry, I mixed the order, is a professor at Ghent University IMEC Institute, and he is here to represent the SOLID project, which was initiated by the inventor of the web, Tim Berners-Lee. Not well. We have this photo where Tim Berners-Lee has a T-shirt on which says, "I didn't invent the internet," and no, I forgot the name. The other one has the T-shirt, "I didn't invent the web." Tim Berners-Lee launched this SOLID project, and Ruben Verborg is one of the cooperators. And next to him is Claudio Cocorocchia, who is with the World Economic Forum, but he will inform us about the Meridio project, which aims to give publishers more control on the advertising revenue streams. And so you see from the selection of the panelists, we are now looking more at concrete technologies and projects. The background for this panel is that the state of the art is a term in the GDPR, and it's a term which means basically what is possible in the technology, what can be done. And the GDPR says when implementing data protection principles and safeguards, the controller has to take account of the state of the art among other factors. That means basically, as we had an example which Giuseppe mentioned in the first panel, that a web service provider who stores passwords without encryption is certainly not, among many other things, is also not following the state of the art. I mean, storing passwords without encryption was already not state in the art in the 1970s when Unix was invented, and they had the only encrypted password stored. So, and we hope, of course, that state of the art has also made progress since then, and the observation and the progress that has been made is quite important, in particular for data protection authorities who will have to figure out, in cases of breaches and in their advisory work, what is the actual state of the art in privacy and data protection by design technology. So that is the general motivation for this panel. And all panelists at some end have worked on either measuring or assessing, documenting, or advancing the state of the art in privacy. And with this introduction, I hand over to Athina for the first presentation.
Okay. Many thanks, Akim. I would like to thank EDPS for inviting ENISA in this very interesting discussion. As we have been working in the notion of the state of the art over the past years, and in my short intervention, I will elaborate a little bit exactly on this notion. So, what do we perceive as state of the art? And perhaps put some questions rather than providing answers for this discussion, which is a big discussion. So, what do we mean, first of all, when we talk about state of the art? What is the state of the art? I would say a very simple explanation could be the best possible or the best available technology at a certain point in time, because it's also very time specific. But again, this very definition has a lot of questions inside it. So, how is best defined? Who defines it? Could it be a standalone entity or should it be a community approach? And also, when we're talking about privacy-enhancing technologies, or technologies in general, I would say that we have totally different levels of readiness and totally different audience. So we might be looking from tools that are in a stage of research idea, or prototypes, or final products. So again, assessing the state, understanding and defining the state of the art is very different for each of these categories. Of course, as Akim already said, in GDPR, in this new obligation for data protection by design, the state of the art is one of the parameters that the controllers need to take into account in order to adopt the appropriate measures. And actually, it's not only there where we see the notion of state of the art in GDPR, we also have it, and we had it in the past in the obligations regarding security measures, Article 32. But I would say, however, that an important point here is that in GDPR, this is only one parameter, and everything needs to be taken into consideration with regard to the risk to the rights and freedoms of data subjects. So, according to GDPR, at least from my point of view, we need to know that the controller needs to understand the state of the art, but at the same time, the adoption of security measures or data protection by design measures will be done based on the risks, which means that maybe it's not always the best available technology for all cases, but it will be the best available in a specific context, in a specific risk environment, let's say. Now, how can we define the state of the art? We have thought about that quite a lot over the past years with ENISA. We have tried to develop, let's say, common frameworks and tools and methodologies to this regard. I think it was already mentioned in the previous panel. This is, of course, the first point, to understand what are we assessing against. So this is how we can address the state of the art. Actually, we worked in two different areas, I would say. On one hand, we tried to develop a generic methodology for assessing the maturity of PETs, of privacy-enhancing technologies. And on the other hand, we tried to look also into specific methodologies and criteria that could help assessing specific types of tools, especially those that are available to end users, like, for example, anti-tracking tools or secure messages. From all this work, I would say that I think there are three very important questions, and as I said, it's open questions probably rather than concrete answers to these questions that we always need to address, and they're not easy to address. So, first point, how can we quantify privacy? Of course, this has always been the question in privacy engineering, and I would say when discussing the characteristics, the criteria of a PET, we need to look, of course, into the vertical, the technical criteria that actually are related to the privacy protection that the tool offers, but also several other criteria that are not maybe directly related to privacy, but are very important to that. For example, usability or maturity of the tool. Then, second point, how can we perform the assessment? We could look into different aspects, like, for example, expert assessment versus self-assessment, both of them having different pros and cons. And we also have this notion of certification also with GDPR, which is something that could also assist in this attempt. But also another important element here is to what depth do we perform this assessment, since it's a very time-specific issue, as we said, the state of the art. And last but not least, how can we present the state of the art? Is it again, maybe this is something that we don't talk very often, but I believe that exactly because we might have totally different audience, we might have developers, we might have controllers, but also might have end users, the way of presenting the available technologies is also very, very different. And this also has a very big difference on how to conduct the assessment. So I had put here an example of one of the criteria that I mentioned before that we try to develop for anti-tracking tools for end users. I'm not going to go into detail because I know we don't have time for that right now. Just very quickly some last points to finish my short intervention. I think that from my personal point of view, defining the state of the art should be a community approach. I don't think it could work otherwise. But having said that, and based on experience that we had in relevant projects at ENISA, this is not at all easy. You need a driving force, and we need to have the structures, the commitments. You need to have everybody on the table, and it's not only the researchers. This is one side of the coin, but you also need the regulators, and you need to also see how structurally this could really operate in practice. And so I think we really have a lot of way to go there. From my personal point of view, my wish, let's say, would not be just for a repository of pets, but even beyond that, of an observatory, I would say, for pets, which could represent the state of the art at a single point in time. And I would also think it's really worth investing on presenting privacy tools to end users. This is not the scope of GDPR. GDPR is focused on the controllers, but end users. And since I understood from this panel, also there was a focus on tracking. I think this is also an area where users can also protect themselves. There are a lot of tools there. Which one is the best? This is another area to discuss regarding the state of the art. So I'm sorry if I passed my time. And I will stop here.
Thank you very much, Asina. Not to lose time, I hand over to Stefan immediately.
Thank you, Achim, for the opportunity to talk here. As you know, there's lots of overlap with Atina's points, so I want to give you a little bit what we can do in some of the categories. So Atina was talking about how to measure the state of the art, and one of these things is of course, it's a little bit more complex than for data, for let's say the traditional security world, where we have our traditional 3 protection goals, which then are solved, well, which then there is a lot of technologies out there which are solving these, and they're solving these better, and we can kind of easily measure this. But there's something we learned from this, and this is there is security notions. And what we have done now recently, we extended this to privacy notions, which allows us now to create a more or less, well, not more or less, a mathematical formal model to define what is allowed to leak and what is not allowed to leak, so that we can compare different technologies to their different goals, so that we can then clearly say a tool is better than the other in protecting a certain property, and another tool might be uncomparable, because this is actually in many cases like this, that we cannot say this one is better than the other. So, and of course, if you then combine this with how much effort is needed, then you get already a bit closer to which tool can be better in practice, right? And then there is where Atina came, and then the question is how mature are these tools, and can they be ready to be used from an implementer or not? But so there, these mathematical models behind this allow us to be there probably a bit quicker, because whenever someone starts to develop, we can start to develop in parallel privacy notion, which then immediately falls into categories, right? So this leads me to my next point, and this is now what is the engineer. What does for the engineer mean privacy by design, and also data protection by design? And there was something in the panel before which Seda made very nicely clear. That it's interesting to see this from either from a management perspective, and in my vision, so to say, or in my idea, I have the impression the management perspective is very, very often very waterfall organized, right? I have a big plan idea, and I say then to my engineer, so to say, as manager, please implement this big idea, and then it should fall down into strategies, into patterns, into a concrete implementation. And then you see the other reality, of course, because this was, of course, now a fiction. The reality is, of course, it is developed in an agile process where maybe even the privacy notions, which we had so nicely on paper before, if you follow this, will change all the time because the actual tool is changing during the development process, even in its aims and its use. And even worse, not only the tool itself changes, because development processes are sometimes overtaken by the reality in society, how the tool is in the end used is different than how the tool was in the initial idea planned. Even the developer did not envision, so to say, the tool will be used like X, Y, Z. And of course, there the quick notions will probably or hopefully help. Yeah. And this was also my last point to this, that we now, and this is a bit in the future, what we now try to do at University of Luxembourg, we also want to look at how we can integrate these metrics as we develop into software development tools which support an agile development process, that is actually the developer can, so to say, see what are the consequences of his doing or her doing. Right. As I said, this last sentence is really just the hope of a starting project. So we'll see that this works. But I think this will be very important to steer the development process while we go. And this is the end of my point.
Thank you. It's a very interesting elements to be put into perspective also with something of the first panel. But then we hand over to a concrete current project, and Walter will tell us what EDRI's initiative is about.
Yep. Well, first of all, like Achim already said, EDRI is a coalition of not Europe-based, but NGOs active in the European policy space, and by that we mean the Council of Europe and the EU institutions. Basically, we have members in about 19 countries. We even have some American members, at least one. And we are active in areas like freedom of expression, data protection, privacy, and so on. And the reason I'm telling this is it's part of the problem we were trying to solve, because EDRI got founded in 2002, and to mention one of the founding fathers of EDRI and one of the founding members, that's the Chaos Computer Club in Germany. Well, you don't have to tell the Chaos Computer Club in Germany how to develop secure and privacy-friendly websites. You may have to tell them how to build websites that look nice, but that's an entirely different story. That's not the topic we have at hand. But that's the kind of, we have, part of our history is in the hacker community. And one of the reasons EDRI was founded, because there was a massive gap in the NGO space, because the traditional human rights organizations like Amnesty International and so on were not really active on human rights in relation to the internet and digital topics. And we still hope at some point to disband EDRI because all the topics are taken over by the traditional human rights organizations. What's happening right now is that we start to collaborate more and more with more traditional human rights organizations. And new human rights organizations have popped up with a less of a techie background and more of a, let's say, I hate the word, end-user perspective, or because I try to consider myself as a citizen. And one of the things that we repeatedly run into, and Achim, can we skip to 3 or 4 slides ahead? Yeah, that one. Is that you start to receive mails from, let's say, a coalition partner that comes from environmental issues or from consumer issues, and you notice, oh, there's a Google Mail, a campaign tracker in there, and their website is full of widgets from Facebook and other less than excellent players in this space. And many angry words were spent on emails to potential partners in campaigns, and people not even aware of the extent they were exposing the visitors to their websites to, let's say, less than benign third parties. We consider Facebook not a very benign third party when it comes to the internet. Neither is Google. Well, we're quite happy with Google's activities in the, let's say, freedom of expression area usually, but when it comes to data protection, it's not exactly a friend of ours. And we consider it a responsibility if you're an NGO, if you're part of civil society, you're by definition somewhat politically active. And a visit to a civil society group is by definition, that web statistic is already sensitive data. It gives an indication of at least an interest in certain politically laden topics. So at some point we decided that we should stop being the grumpy, scruffy, bearded old Unix man, and mostly men, sadly, and have started a project which is nowhere near finished to have some ethical guidelines. And let me emphasize, this is from an entirely opposite end of the spectrum. This is assuming that you're operating in a somewhat sane democracy with a somewhat applicable rule of law. I know GGHQ in the UK is not necessarily fully adhering to that limit, and some of the other EU members are kind of dodgy in that respect. But assuming that you're operating in that kind of environment, because otherwise you should be running everything on Tor hidden services, but assuming that you could be on the web as an NGO, what would be good practices? And the problem there is that a lot of web developers that quite often do things for free for NGOs are not even aware of this basic notion of whatever you look at on the web looks back at you. So we've basically looked into a bunch of anti-patterns which we happen to notice all the time. Like you're organizing an event with a lecture and you're using, let's say, Eventbrite. I'm not saying that Eventbrite is a bad actor, but it's a third party that has third-party goals with collecting that data. What will be a helpful tool for organizing such an event and still getting an idea of how many people may show up in your event without sharing that data with a third party? There's some lovely tools for that, developed by Framasoft, fantastic French NGO, by the way, who does a lot of good work in the space of developing web services and making them freely available and on an open source basis, which are privacy friendly. You want to use video. Can we have the next slide? Because those are examples of some of those let's say you want to use video on your website. The basic reflex of any web developer is to embed YouTube videos on it. Because YouTube is free, it has a fantastic capacity to deal with peak traffic. It also means that if you have a campaign video on your website, Google gets to know how popular it is and also maybe insert some advertisements to your videos. From the French hacker sphere, there's an interesting tool called PeerTube. It's not the state of the art when it comes to privacy-friendly engineering because it's BitTorrent-based. And as people who are familiar with BitTorrent, how many people are familiar with BitTorrent here? You bloody pirates. But now, BitTorrent was meant to distribute large volumes of data quickly by reusing, it's a true peer-to-peer protocol, by sharing bandwidth and capacity. And by its very nature, anyone who's in a so-called BitTorrent swarm who's sharing data through a BitTorrent protocol can see others on a particular file. It became massively popular because of, let's say, what we call unauthorized cultural sharing. Others call it piracy, but we like to call it that. But, well, I'm talking about use cases where you have the rights to the video in question, and there's no real need to share the user statistics of that video with a third party like Google. I'm not saying that PeerTube is the state of the art, but it is a step up from using Google's YouTube. Basically, it's more a list of what we consider less than bad practices. It's in development, and I'm out of time, as indicated by Achim. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we have two other projects, but the first one is Meridio. It's represented today by Claudio Cocorocchia, which is also aiming at a concrete change on web use, but it's coming from the other end, from the publisher's perspective, if I see that. Claudio, please.
Thank you. So before I get into Project Meridio, I want to just give an idea to everybody of why the World Economic Forum is involved in this. Why personal data and privacy? You know, what's of interest in this space to the World Economic Forum? And for us, personal data and privacy is, let's say for us, a fundamental challenge that impacts many different ecosystems. It impacts the media entertainment information ecosystem, it impacts the financial monetary system, it impacts health and healthcare, it impacts education, food, agriculture. So looking at it systematically from a systems approach, personal data and privacy and the challenges that we face in the 21st century are fundamental. They create a ripple effect across many different ecosystems. So we tend to take a more of a macro view around looking at solutions around personal data and privacy and how that can impact, on a much larger scale, let's say high-level scale, many different ecosystems. And our perspective is that essentially privacy engineering in itself is difficult, it's challenging depending on the context. Taking GDPR and translating it into a workable technical solution is difficult, but it's not impossible. But the biggest problem that we're facing isn't an engineering problem, it's a business model problem. This is the fundamental problem that GDPR is hitting. And unless we get that right, then the engineering side really won't matter very much. I'll give you an example. I think you'll find this amusing. In July of last year, I had a very tough time finding the right email to send, address to send to Facebook a complaint about data. It was very difficult to find them on the website. Finally, I found it and I sent this message. Under Article 7 of EU General Data Protection Regulation, I officially opt out of any and all consent to Facebook in using my personal data for any purposes other than confirmed as strictly necessary to run the service. I do not allow Facebook to use any of my data for advertisements or to pass it on to third parties, either by partnership or sale. So under GDPR Article 7, this is my right to do this. Okay? This was sent in July 2018. In August 2018, so let's say more than a month later, I get this reply from Facebook. Hi, thanks again for contacting us. Our specialist team is investigating your request, which has presented some complex issues that we're very carefully considering. Unfortunately, due to the complexity of the investigation, this process may take up to another 2 months, as permitted under GDPR. We take your request seriously, and we appreciate your understanding and patience. As of today, I still have not gotten a reply. Imagine if every citizen in the European Union sent that message to Facebook. Okay? This is not an engineering problem. Facebook can easily turn off advertisements for me as a user. They can stop processing my personal data, stop selling it to third parties. Imagine if hundreds of millions of European citizens sent the same message. This is a business model problem. It would destroy Facebook's business model. Okay? But Facebook is a $50 billion a year company, all right? The fines that are being passed against Facebook by the European Union is diddly squat. They're hundreds of millions even. Let's say they're even hundreds of millions. That's nothing compared to the annual revenue. Google is same situation. CNIL's decision that happened a few weeks ago that fined Google, it was about a $50 million dollar fine or €50 million fine. And basically, the important thing here is it basically sends a message that tech must stop building advertising profiles for people until it has properly informed of what it is doing, plus receive their explicit consent. Okay, Google is a over $100 billion company. They don't care about these fines. So fundamentally, the European Union can keep fining Google and Facebook, and nothing will happen until we resolve the business model problem. And the biggest issue here isn't in define that business model problem, a solution to that business model problem, it has to come from the citizen's perspective as well. The majority of citizens don't even know what derived data is. They don't know what a personal identity is. They have no clue. Once they learn about what's happening to the personal data, then they say, well, actually, this isn't very good. I don't want them to process my personal data. I wouldn't give them consent. So if we have a situation where users understand exactly what's happening and they start rescinding or revoking that consent, we're going to get into catastrophic problems that will have ripple effects across the ecosystem. Facebook will stop becoming free. Google will stop becoming free. There has to be a business model solution. So the engineering is important, but it's the business model that has to be found. A solution has to be found. Project Meridio, I'm not sure how much time I have left, is something that the forum's interested in, has been sponsoring, and helped basically get off the ground because it's looking at taking more of a business model solution to GDPR. It's looking at designing a data schema and a marketplace for exchanging personal data amongst digital publishers, where that data has been 100% consented by users. So basically taking all the articles in GDPR and actually the 50 or so that are in there that actually have a technical, let's say, relevance, and transforming those into an actual technical solution. The best of Mozilla's engineers have been working on this, and we think we've come to a solution. We're very close to it. And this year we're going to be developing this marketplace and data schema. And we're going to be going out looking for initial funding, because this is going to be a nonprofit marketplace that we're trying to get off the ground, and then turn it into more a self-sufficient business model. So I don't want to give more details there, but again, as opposed to it being an engineering problem, our perspective is that it's very much a business model problem.
Thank you very much, Claudio. And then we go to the last panelist, which is Ruben Verborg, and he will tell us something about Solid.
Privacy is overrated. I've been working on the Solid project for more than 2 years with the inventor of the web, trying to add more privacy to the web. Truth is, no one cares. If you talk to people and say, hey, we've got this new platform, it's like Facebook, but it's more private, they say, meh. I mean, they don't really care. And that's important, because it means if we want to do privacy engineering, maybe we shouldn't think about privacy too much. People don't care too much about their privacy, and companies don't either, frankly. I mean, we talked about business models, but no company has in their business model, let's violate privacy. They don't do it on purpose. It's not a goal. It is a side effect of what they're doing. So our loss of privacy is a side effect to them. And that's really important, because I disagree when Claudio says it's not an engineering problem. I would say it's not a privacy problem. It is a problem of engineering and business models, and to see all of those things together. But it's important to see that privacy on all of this is just a side effect. If we tackle it at its core, we will not succeed. So let me elaborate. What we aim to do with Solid is to redefine the relationship between people, data, and applications. As simple as that. The problem today is that applications hold on to data. Facebook is data, LinkedIn is data, Twitter is data. They all have that data, and that's how they make money. That is their business model indeed. And as a side effect, they violate our privacy. Another side effect is that it stifles innovation, right? At the moment, if I have an excellent idea to build an app, well, too bad, I will not succeed because I don't have the data. So every new developer has this burden of harvesting data in order to get started. And this is really the problem. This is what it is. So we have to propose a new way of developing apps, engineering side, with new business models to make money out of that. And this is how we can change things for privacy. Concretely, what we do with Solid is that people get to store their data wherever they want, independent of the app. So every piece of data you create, you decide where you store it, and you can choose the app that you use. So you can choose the app you want, I can choose the app that I want. And this creates competition between apps. This gives an incentive to innovate. Because applications are no longer focused on harvesting data, they can focus on being a better application. So everybody wins. It's nonsense that all companies benefit from violating our privacy. Trust me, many companies wish that they wouldn't have to harvest data, that they wouldn't have to basically be a privacy violator, but the market is kind of forcing them into that. So we need an engineering solution where people can hold on to their data, can share it with the people and the apps that they want, and then apps can be built based on quality. And yes, this means that not everything will be free. Some apps will be free, but then you know that they might do things you don't like. So if you don't like that, you have choice to pay for a different app. And this choice is really important. Like, we should not dictate to people like, well, your privacy should not be violated. If a person wants that, they're free to do so. It's all about choice. People should get the choice of storing their data independently from the apps, so that they can choose their storage location and their applications. And if they choose to keep their data private, they can. And it's a choice they don't have. You can go to Facebook today and say, well, here's $5 a month, please don't violate my privacy. As you've tried, that doesn't work. So we need to have this choice. And this choice will bring innovation. And as a side effect of that innovation, we will see applications that don't violate our privacy because they don't work with data ownership. So in the end, we're all better off if we don't focus on that. So I don't think it's even a privacy problem. It is a problem of the way apps are built today, which is engineering, and how people try to derive money from that. So the key to giving back control over privacy is changing how apps are built and how money is made with them. And this is what we're trying to do with the Solid project.
Thank you very much, and thank you also for being the first speaker today who actually keeps time and leaves even a few seconds for the rest. Yes, so in this first round of the panel we have had the starting points for everyone, and I think we have a separation kind of, or two different perspectives from those who try to develop something new and those who try to figure out what is being developed and could be used. So I would then ask Sina and Stefan to kind of comment or ask smart questions to Walter, Claudio and Ruben.
Okay, I will try to make a smart comment. No, actually, there were a lot of very interesting points. I think one point that I found particularly interesting with regard to the notion of the state of the art, that from the point of view that we're looking at it, is what Walter was saying about the good and the bad solutions, let's say. And I think that we really do need a way to put this information somewhere forward. For example, you mentioned Eventbrite. It's not the specific company. I think there are many like these companies today, and we have been looking for tools like that to organize events. All of them have the same type of problems. How can I find the information? If I'm a small company, I have no idea about this kind of tools. How can I find this information about this good solution? I think this is an important point here. And going back to the discussion about checklists that we have in the previous panel, it doesn't have to be a checklist or an absolute thing, like this is the only thing that you should be doing, or this is the list of the good tools and this is the list of the bad tools. But good examples of tools that can do it in a different way is very, very, very important. And I think this can really help build up the state of the art. And I think if we take it a step further, this is not only about privacy, it's about human rights in general, because if you look into new technologies like, for example, artificial intelligence, data analytics, then we're looking to further more implications. It goes beyond privacy, I would say. And so this is a very, very important direction. Now, this one point I wanted to say. Another thing I wanted to say is that I agree with Claudio that yes, it is about the business model, but it is also about engineering, as Ruben said. And here, I think I disagree with the idea that with the point that the DPAs will keep finding Google or any Google in the world, and this is not going to change anything. I don't agree with that. I don't think it's not a matter of budget only at the end. It's about the mentality that it creates. And maybe, I don't know, maybe I'm too optimistic, but I think that this type of mentality takes long to create. It takes long to make users understand that, but slowly it will come. I think at the end, if a lot of finds like that are put. It's not about the money that will be paid by these companies, and I agree it's nothing to Google this type of fines, but it is about the notion that it creates. Like, take for example Facebook as an example. There's been a lot of discussions around it. Will you say that Facebook stopped? No, it has not stopped, but many people slowly are reconsidering the way they're sharing their data, as far as I can see it. So I believe that this enforcement, if we put it like this way, is important. And then, of course, this, will make people at the end to care about their privacy. I mean, Ruben said people don't care about privacy. Yes, they don't care because they don't know, and they don't see their options. If they can see their options, and if they can see also what all this means, then maybe they will start caring. And of course, having tools that can help them control and choose, this, of course, it will facilitate the whole thing.
Thank you. Stefan?
Actually, I agree with the lots of Atina, but if one extra effect here, and this is, I don't believe in this notion of if people have the choice, because even if the tools are there, they often, in fact, don't have the choice. For example, we can make a short test how many people here are using WhatsApp, while for WhatsApp there is secure alternatives, and you will see they are not used, and they're equally easy to use. So in a way, and the interesting thing is that we are a bit strange in a digital world where we say, oh, this has to be a free market. It seems to be almost the holy cow. It's on the free market, and it only this one will solve the problem. While in most of the other fields in the physical world, if we are talking about safety, that elevator doors are stopping if you stick your feet in the elevator is not because of the market. If you go to a country where this is not regulated, they will not do this. They will crush your foot and you will be disabled for the rest of your life. If you look at our cars today, it is because there's regulation which forces producers to have seat belts. It's because there is a force to have brake assistance and all these things. Industry was very, very innovative by following regulation in these cases, right? I mean, and I think this is my big point here, that I don't believe that the free market will solve it. And this is also, of course, an economic problem, I fully agree.
Thank you very much. I would ask the three people working on projects to respond quickly, but really quickly, so that we have a bit of time for questions from the audience. Walter, would you like to begin?
No, I'm only going to make matters worse by tossing out that people do care about privacy in the concrete, maybe not in the abstract. And two other things for Claudio and Ruben. I'd like to hear thoughts about network effects, because that was basically what Stefan was touching upon. And lastly, I would toss out to say consent is dead anyway, not because consent is not a good way to have a basis for processing, but more because, especially in the context of online services, the well-informed and specific part of the consent you want to obtain is hard to satisfy.
So first of all, absolutely. I think with time, it's not a question of can we get the web without tracking. It's going to be a question of when we'll get the web without tracking. So absolutely. I still think there's got to be some fundamental market shifts before we really get to the stage where the network effect won't be important. And you're right, there is a huge network effect. I mean, if Facebook wrote back to me saying, actually, Claudio, go screw yourself, you're not going to get any rescinding of your data and we're going to keep doing it, I'm not going to stop using Facebook, honestly, because it's such an important, let's say, part of, my lifestyle at this stage. And most users will follow the same situation, will be in the same situation. So I think, Nadell from the CEO of Microsoft said it at our annual meeting in Davos last week. Tim Cook has been saying it consistently. they're harping on the fact that everyone has a right to privacy and ownership of the personal data, because their businesses are built on ecosystems that don't, let's say, are less, let's say, dependent on personal data. Not at zero, but Apple's success is its ecosystem. Microsoft is the software licenses. So there's less of the personal data sort of harvesting business model there, and they're using that very publicly as a value add. And why they're pushing for more regulation on Google and Facebook and whatnot, because it'll put them in a more competitive advantage. So, Gartner also released a study at the end of last year saying that the big trend for 2019 is going to be, one of the key trends is going to be on digital ethics and privacy. So we're seeing that the business community is being serious about this, and they're looking to find new solutions, especially in news. We're going behind quality in news and information is going behind the paywall now, because we know that advertised-funded news basically pushes misinformation to be spread and really stimulates disinformation operations. So there is a change, but it is very gradual. And I think that it's I don't know what the solution is for Facebook and Google, who are blatantly infringing on GDPR as we speak. There's no doubt about it. I don't know what the solution is there, because finding them is not the solution. So anyway, I don't have a full answer.
I disagree that it's going to help giving people controls of their privacy, because it's just too complex. Like, this is a phenomenon of consent fatigue, where people just click away all the windows that they do get. So I think we need to make it just less attractive to invade privacy, and the free market is important there, but it should be specific. The important thing is that the markets are decoupled. Right now, the data market and the app market are one and the same. They're coupled. Let me give you an example. WhatsApp, indeed. Why don't people move to something secure? Because they lose their messages. Why don't people leave Facebook? Because they lose their data. Sure, you can get it out, but you can't really plug it in somewhere else. So what we need to do is separate the markets and have free markets, one free market for apps and one free market for data storage. And it should be independent. So this means that I pick my storage provider. I have a free choice. And I pick my app provider. If I dislike the app, I move apps. And that's something you cannot do today. So the problem is not the markets, the problem is the coupling of two markets that really should be independent. The app market should not determine where I store my data and vice versa. If we get those decoupled, then I think we have like an innovation driver to not violate privacy, basically. And I think that's going to be much stronger.
Thank you very much. Just before we take questions, just one question to the audience. Who in the audience is not using WhatsApp? Okay. And who of those using WhatsApp or not using WhatsApp is using another more privacy-friendly and secure messenger? Okay, this is still a minority in both cases in this audience. But
didn't I tell you that people don't care?
Yeah, I mean, I had to cancel my Facebook account last year because they wanted to force me to consent to things which were far beyond what was acceptable. But I can fully understand the pain that this kind of move takes. So, are there any questions from the audience to the panelists? Well, I would have one question to Ruben. How, I mean, the Solid project would need to completely turn the current architecture of the web around. And what is the path, the migration path from the current situation to a new paradigm in this respect?
So I don't really believe in a smooth migration path. I think what needs to happen is we need to focus first on those experiences that the current systems cannot do, because people are convinced by experiences, not by privacy or anything else. Just to give you an example, I mean, the core problem is silos, right? I cannot share a Facebook picture with my LinkedIn colleagues. You have to move people or data. So systems in which you can freely share things you want to share will already be an improvement. And so instead of trying to imitate what we have in a more privacy-friendly way, we should focus on new experiences that the siloed systems cannot do. This is something that will convince people. So Solid is not there to overthrow all the systems that exist. It's rather about creating new things that don't exist yet and that really should. And I mean, if we should get people into this with features and experiences, because the ideological way will not work, I think. So that's what we're trying to do.
Okay, thank you. And I have a question to Claudio, because you say it's a business model problem, and Meridio would want to promote a different business model than the current one, which would mean that the advertising revenue comes more closely and more directly to the publishers than to those intermediates who are currently focusing the promoting the tracking-based system. How would that change come into practice?
So Meridio in itself wouldn't constitute a new business model. It's essentially an improvement on the current advertising-funded business model that a lot of publishers are forced to, let's say, deal with. Because their paywall, let's say, strategy would not work. There's very few paywall strategies that are working. And it has to do with volume, has to do with brand, has to do with reach, and many elements that sort of make a paywall strategy, at least in digital publishing, is being successful. So a lot of the sort of smaller independent digital publishers are still forced to use the advertising funded model. The problem is that currently they are relying mostly on third-party data. So data that they buy that has not been consented to, where there's a lot of, let's say, dirty data in there, or things that perhaps are just plugged in by these third parties. And what Meridio does is it creates an environment where it builds more trust between the reader, so the end user that accesses that digital publisher's website, and it creates a stronger bond of trust, where the digital publisher does not have to rely on third-party data. By the end user or the citizen consenting their data to that digital publisher because they trust that digital publisher, that person has full consent of use of that personal data for advertising purposes, but where their users also ensure that they get quality news or quality information. So it's supposed to increase the level of quality that smaller publishers are actually creating, because they have access to cleaner, better, more consented data. So it's supposed to sort of improve the current advertising model and get rid of a lot of the, let's say, black box, which is ad tech, and let's say third-party generated data, which is causing a lot of issues at the moment.
Thank you. Walter, is there a question? Yep, please.
Say that, raise your hand.
Thank you. I work in academia and in industry. And one of the questions I have, we think we clearly recognize sort of the economics behind data and technology, and how that impacts engineering. Walter alluded to network effect. And I think what we have not explicitly mentioned here is the lock-in effect that network effects have. So my question, I suppose, to Stefan, as well as Claudio, is are you looking, for example, for the Solid project, are you looking specifically at the data portability rights in the GDPR? Do you see a specific, do you consider that in your migration path to overcome lock-in effects? And are you seeing any traction in practice?
So for the Solid project, I think it's more Ruben.
Yes, so indeed, the lock-in is what I meant with the separation of the markets, right? So the fact that data is coupled to an application right now is what creates this lock-in indeed. So separating those is very important. And I think GDPR is an excellent driver for that, because at least now we have the right to get our data out in a structured format. So legally speaking, we can already collect all of our data and put it in a place that we choose. The technical challenge is now to make the data interoperable with different kinds of applications, but at least we have the data already. So I think that's a good driver. So I think we've got, I mean, regulation-wise, I think we've got the things we need to get started already. Because in the beginning we talked about over-regulation and so on. I think there's quite some things we can do already with what we have, but we need to start working with them, I would say.
Thank you.
Well, and there is actually my problem a bit with this separation in my head, at least. My feeling is that people are happy in their golden cage. The lock-in effect is there, but very few people actually do feel this lock-in. So why should I move? Why should I mean, for me, my impression now is you want to separate the data plane from the apps. My first reaction is, yeah, this makes more administrative work for me as a user. It has to, because it's now suddenly something is visible which was intransparent before. So why should I move? Because usually the problem is not to move from A to B. I get all my friends to the same place.
Let me introduce you to my mother, who really hates the fact that she has to talk to me on Signal, and to my brother on WhatsApp, and to my sister on Viber. And this is exactly the lock-in problem, because the data is coupled to the application. So she would be happy if you could use one app, and preferably the app that's easiest to use, and then communicate to all of us independent of what we're using. So I think people are feeling those things a lot.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. 2 quick questions. Once again, sorry, for Ruben, and the other one for Atina. Ruben, how do you see the problem of I like very much the idea of the separation between the two things, so the data and applications. On the other hand, how realistic do you see the fact that there should be a standardization? And what about innovation, new features, copyright on new features? How does it, couple with that? And what about the economy of that? The fact of data mining for good, for good reasons. For example, I can understand the reason of a personal data mining application. On the other hand, this could, there are economies of scale also in the result you want to get if you limit yourself to your data. I don't know. And for Adina, the question is, I think we have supported also in our opinion the fact of having a repository of, state-of-the-art technologies and solutions. How realistic is that? What's the solution for that to take, to fly? Do you have any idea? Do you have any perspective? So these are the 2 questions. Thank you.
I'll be brief so I can pass it on. So the good thing is we don't need to agree on everything. Yeah. Like we can have layered agreements. So applications doing text messages only need to agree on that. They don't need to agree on pictures or videos and vice versa. So by just having composable standards instead of like one big book we all need to agree on, this is how we plan to move that forward.
Yes, I have also a comment on Ruben, but maybe I will do it after. Sorry. Now, for what you said, I think, as I said in the first round, I think that this cannot be a standalone thing. It cannot be an institution or DPA or a private organization for sure establishing the state of the art per se. It needs to be a community approach. It needs to be something that gives the possibility to everybody to contribute. But for example, one approach that we have been thinking is the possibility to create something like a repository, as you said, where everybody could offer their products, their pets, or present other tools of others, and give the possibility to everybody in the community to provide an assessment. And like that, for a given tool, for example, you can have different types of assessments. But of course, it sounds easier than it is in practice, because first of all you need to do that in a structured way. Then how do you how do you define expert? Does every opinion, does every assessment has the same level of importance? And how do you maintain such a thing? You need a driving force. You need something bigger than someone just running it. So I didn't really answer your question, because we also, as you know, and we have discussed in the past, we are also considering exactly these aspects. As we would have liked at NISA to participate in such an effort, we have worked in the area of the generic methodologies, let's say, because this is obviously the first step to have the common criteria, to understand that, to agree, let's say, that we assess and we define the state of the art based on some specific concrete criteria. This is the first step. But then, of course, this is something that still, the community building, I think we still need more maturity also. As we progress also, now that we have this new possibility with data protection by design in GDPR, to see in practice how this could work. And as I said before, maybe this is not just a list of tools, like, okay, you have this type of tools for, I don't know, secure messaging, or because we mentioned this example. Maybe it is also something of different nature, like what is possible solutions. This is or bad examples, or good examples, or possible alternatives. It can have a totally different approach than a list. I mean, because when we think of a repository, sometimes we think of a list. It doesn't have to be exactly like that. And also another point, I think I mentioned it also, it is totally different when we're talking about a repository or state of the art for those that are going to develop, or even the data controllers that could adopt possible solutions, than when we talk for end users. Because there we need to be very, very simple in our presentation. A user is not going to take, my mother, for example, as it was mentioned before as well, she's not going to take a day reading the different features of a tool, and probably she's not going to be able to understand. So it has to be easy. And this is also a very big challenge, really big challenge, if you want to also be objective. So these are still, as I said, open questions. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. Any other reaction on this question? Okay. I think there's, and if there are any questions from the audience, please just raise your hand and you will be given the microphone. But Seda, please, coming from behind.
Yeah, so first of all, I love the observatory idea, and cannot support it enough. And I think it would be great if people in this room have more feedback of what an observatory could do, because I think we're in the beginning of imagining something that could be there. And it could be very valuable for engineers and developers, especially, to have a go-to place instead of going to Google or Stack Overflow and saying, what do I do for privacy, which usually leads to a big rabbit hole and you don't come out of it and you give up. So total support for that. My question, again, based on observations, is that it's not that because of advertisement, a lot of these companies collect data. That is also happening. I don't want to say that that's not happening. But what I've seen in the last 20 years is that software engineering has become data-centric. And so we can change the business models as much as we want, but if we have developers that are constantly putting out feelers to see how the features are arriving, if they're being picked up, if people are struggling with it by virtue of tracking the users, or if you're in the service ecosystem and you're tracking for the use of licenses, I can make a whole list in which software engineering and software development is data-centric. I would say that it's much more than business models, and I would say it's an engineering problem, and I would say that privacy-enhancing technologies should address some of the needs of developers to track the use of their features without being intrusive. But I wonder what the panel thinks about that.
So, yes, Walter.
I would agree that it's also an attitude issue. To give a recent example, Microsoft, which by and large tends to be a well-behaved citizen in this particular part of the digital space, it turns out it sends back way more telemetry data for its Office 365 users than it ought to do, which is highly problematic. from a data protection perspective, I sometimes try to toss out the idea that data is not a new oil but a new asbestos. I hope that at some point it may catch on, especially on the financial side of the equation, because if funders ask you how much asbestos do you have, that tends to end up in awkward questions. I'd like to respond a little bit to the observatory idea. I do it by all means, but I would also like to abuse this stage, since there are quite a few people from DPAs in the room. Why isn't there any Article 41 certification going on at all in the EU, as far as I'm aware? Because one of the problems we have been talking about is the GDPR is principle-based. To apply that in concrete practice, you need much more prescriptive rules with a much more temporary nature than the GDPR. Article 41, the certification schemes, which basically will result in lists of don't do this or do this in this particular context, will be tremendously helpful for engineers, because then they would have at least their checklist with a best use before date. So I'm wondering what the stumbling blocks for getting there are.
Okay. Is there anybody from a DPA in the room who would like to answer to that question? Benjamin, maybe you can say something from practice.
We can tell where we are with the DPP.
Yeah, no, I mean it's clear the EDPB is working on that. You know that they have just recently issued guidance on accreditation and on certification, which was more oriented to the process which is behind that. And the idea of the GDPR is basically that others than the DPAs come up with certification schemes, and the DPAs acknowledge this and recognize it. But I see many interests to speak on the podium, so maybe Ruben first and then Stefan.
So briefly on the observation about engineers and data. So yes, people need data to develop apps, but you can turn this around as well. I've had companies knock on my door the past couple of months saying like, hey, we've got great algorithms, but we don't want to collect data because we're not in the data business, we're in the app business. So they like the GDPR idea because they don't want to own data. It's too expensive, there's too much liability. So just because developers need data for their apps doesn't mean they need to store the data, need to control or own that data. We need to give it to them at some point to do their thing, but we can always take it back after that. So again, this is for the decoupling, but these things are important because it shows it's not just business, it's not just engineering. Yes, they need data, but the question is not should or shouldn't we give it to them. The question is, can we let them use it without endangering our privacy? And those things are possible. So we can use that fact to our advantage.
Okay, Stefan.
Yeah. Well, to the certification, maybe it needs a little bit more time. I can say if I was today not with the head of the University of Luxembourg here, but with another head, then I spend like every 2 weeks a couple of hours with people from the Luxembourgish DPA who are working on certification schemes, but and of course this is also in the framework of the accreditation here. So there is schemes on the way, but they need a bit more time, I would say.
I can also add that we have in Schleswig-Holstein, we had already a certification before the GDPR, and we had to stop it because it is not fully compliant so far with the GDPR, and we have a very complex and long process in Germany. I can only speak for Germany because besides of the DPAs, there's also an agency which is responsible for certifications. And these two agencies have to get along with another, and it's a very long process because there are two worlds colliding also there, and I think they are on the last run now, but we need time for that also, and it's a pity, but I think in this year or in the next year this all will be set, and in Germany there will be a certification process.
Yes.
Sorry, just a quick comment. I think that we put maybe too many hopes in certification, to be a little bit provocative, because first of all, it's not a mandatory scheme, and second, in certification, a lot is about the assurance level and how deep you can go, and this I'm not sure to what extent we can reach it, at least to the technical side, as in GDPR certification is about the process per se. And so, although I find this idea very interesting, because of course certification certifies, so we can have certainty, this is the whole scope, I wonder at the end whether this is going to be a tool that can solve all the problems we're discussing today, although I also mentioned it in my presentation, for the reasons that I just said. It's, I guess, something to be seen in practice. But even if we look into the whole aspect of security certification, let's say, again, I mean, there's different levels of certification. You have, let's say, the very formal certification schemes that go through a very long process and so on, but are extremely expensive. They're things that only big players can do in practice, right? And then you have lower levels of assurance, and this doesn't always create the certainty that we would like to see, from my point of view.
Any other reactions from the panel? No. Then Jan?
Yeah, so I think I just want to point out also, Benjamin, former colleague, I was with ULD a long time ago, and for a long time. There's a difference between the Article 40 and the Article 42. And only the Deutsche Akkreditierungsstelle, the thing Benjamin just mentioned, only applies to the certification process under the SEAL scheme for Article 42. For the codes of conduct, which were raised earlier, this doesn't apply. And with all due to respect for the privacy DPAs, I'm a little underwhelmed by the efforts there. I personally requested under Freedom of Information an overview of the schemes that are currently under approval, but have not received an answer from the EDPS nor from my Berlin DPA. So I'd really be interested in knowing what's going on. I looked into several options where those schemes, those codes of conduct would be interesting to develop. I'm also receiving less than overwhelming feedback from some of the civil society spaces, but I'm open for changes in that. In the early days of the GDPR, there was huge talk in Germany about the dying of blogs and things like that. So I approached a number of friends in civil society and said, well, let's do a code of conduct. I don't believe that the GDPR really exposes problems to a blog if you're not interested in collecting data illegitimately. But I mean, if you want to be friends with Facebook and Google, you might run into problems. It's going to be a little bit more difficult. But if you want to have a clean, blog on the web, that should be possible. Let's do a code of conduct. But there was not a lot of interest, frankly, from the community. But I mean, that may just be my limited point of view, and I'm very happy to see what was presented by Adri right now.
Thank you very much. Actually, with this statement, our time has run out for this panel. So I would like to thank the panelists and the colleagues from the audience who have contributed to this discussion. And before we move to the cafe, I hand over the space to Thomas Zerdik, who will summarize and wrap up the discussions of today.